event is the Medical Coaches Corner featuring our star athlete, Dr. Sherrie All. Dr. All is passionate about empowering people to use their brains brilliantly to live better, lead better, and love better. And we could all use a little more love in our world today. She is an international speaker, writer, licensed clinical neurorehabilitation psychology and brain health expert, and owner and director of Chicago Center for Cognitive Wellness. Watch for her forthcoming book in the neuroscience of memory, 7 skills to optimize your brain power, improve memory, and stay sharp at any age. Due to come out early in 2021. You can reserve your copy on our website today. Now, Dr. All, please take it away and teach us how to harness our brain destiny.
Okay. Hello. I just said a bunch of words to you on mute. Thank you, Susie, for that really great introduction. I'm really honored to be here on such a great panel of experts. And Susie, can you give me some feedback if you're seeing my slides?
I am, and they're up and ready to go.
All right, thanks a lot. So as Susie said, I have my book coming out in early 2021. So if you'd like to get on the email list to get a notification for when that comes out, feel free to shoot me an email here, or you can go to my speakers page of my website and fill out the form and sign up there. So my job here is the Coach's Corner. So I've got my whistle and my clipboard. So let's huddle up. We have digested a whole lot of information today about legal issues, medical issues, brain health, lots of neuroscience. So Dr. Brond and Dr. Benheim have given you lots and lots of really great information about this epidemic, this public health crisis that we're facing. We were facing this crisis coming into the COVID-19 pandemic, and by the grace of God, we'll still be, managing this when things are all over. And so my goal here is to teach you a little bit more about brain health and how to really harness your brain's destiny. Dr. Benheim has given you a lot of a really great foundation of the science, and my goal is to help kind of bring it home. So again, it's the Coach's Corner, so feel free to shoot out those questions. Susie's going to be watching those in the background, and so Susie, feel free to interrupt me with questions. What I'd really like to do for this period of time is to help people kind of sort through all the technical information that's kind of come your way. And so I'm going to do a little bit of a recap of what Dr. Benheim went over, and then I'll focus in a little bit more on neuropsychological assessments and cognitive assessments. There's been a lot of talk today about the Montreal Cognitive Assessment, the Mini Mental Status Exam. Dr. Brond alluded to the fact that I'd be talking a little bit more about neuropsychological assessment. So I do want to spend a little bit of time talking about that too, and kind of answering all of your questions. So I want to talk to you a little bit about what are the main approaches for handling this major public health crisis that we're facing of dementia? And I know we've talked a little bit about some of the statistics, but I want to recap a couple of things. We're expecting the prevalence of Alzheimer's disease to triple in the next 30 years. This is huge. And by the year 2050, we're expected in the United States to be spending over $1 trillion a year on just Alzheimer's disease. Now, only about 15% of the cost of caring for somebody with a cognitive decline comes from direct medical care. 85% of the cost, as you may already know, comes from other types of costs, loss of income, loss of a spouse or a caregiver's income. You know, the main difference between these types of health disorders versus something like heart disease or diabetes is that most people with cognitive decline often have to stop working, and then they often have to be supervised. And so a lot of time and resources goes into taking care of people with cognitive declines that isn't really required for a lot of other medical conditions. And people with cognitive decline don't go down in a vacuum. The stress related to taking care of somebody with a cognitive disorder or with any actually chronic disease, will increase your mortality by about 63%. And I would argue that taking care of somebody with a cognitive decline may actually be more stressful than taking care of somebody with diabetes or heart disease or maybe cancer, but it's a little bit more acute. So let's talk again about how to keep our brains healthy, because we are very excited, hopefully, that there will be some disease modifying treatments. And unless we change the course of trajectory, we're facing, again, like I said, these major public health issues. And so we're expecting the prevalence of Alzheimer's disease to triple in the next 30 years unless some sort of preventable method is developed. Well, like Dr. Benheim just told you, we already have a lot of preventable factors that can go into improving your cognitive health. Of course, we would love to have a disease-modifying medication, but in the meantime, there's a lot that you can do to harness your brain's destiny. So dementia doesn't really have to be an inevitable course of the normal aging process. So just to kind of recap a little bit of what Dr. Benheim had taught us, I want to start by telling you a story about brains. Circa 1989. So back in the 1980s, this was when we didn't have fancy imaging like we do now to see some of these beta amyloid plaques growing in the brain. A group of researchers asked people to donate their brain tissue after they had passed away. And some of the people who donated their brains, when they died, they were sharp as a tack. They, still very independent, go into all the classes, very, very sharp older adults. And some of the people who donated their brain tissue when they died had really advanced signs of dementia. They couldn't remember their grandchildren's names. They weren't able to take care of themselves. And these researchers wondered, can we tell the difference between who is in these two different clinical groups based off of how much actual Alzheimer's is growing in their brains? And so they did that. They did kind of a blind count. And what do you think they found between these two groups? Do you think that they found more Alzheimer's pathology growing in the brains of people who had really advanced signs of dementia? Well, what they actually found was that there was the same amount of Alzheimer's disease, the same amount of beta amyloid plaques growing in the cells. And so they thought, well, that's really interesting because, we know that this is the pathology that causes Alzheimer's disease, but how is it that there are some people who can have the same amount of Alzheimer's disease growing in the brain and still be sharp as a tack? So they thought, is there something different about these brains? And so they did do some looking, and they found that, yes, there were some really key differences. The people who were sharp as a tack had actually more brain left over. So their brains were heavier, there were more cells when they did kind of a cell count of how many brain cells were there. And so some key differences. They also found that these people had lived their lives differently. And so as Dr. Benheim just told you, in these early studies, we found that people who had more brain left over tended to be more active throughout their lives, not just intellectually, but also physically and socially. And so about the year 2000, it's great that Dr. Benheim had worked at Columbia University and trained there. One of my healthcare heroes is a neuropsychologist at Columbia University named Yakov Stern, who put together a theory that called cognitive reserve, which Dr. Benheim told you a bit about. I'm going to tell you a little bit more about it. So about the year 2000, Dr. Stern took data from what we had just seen in those Alzheimer's studies, and combined it with other data that we were seeing in stroke and traumatic brain injury that showed that a lot of the times it didn't matter like how big the stroke was or how much Alzheimer's pathology was growing in the brain. That didn't seem to always predict how quickly a person was going to lose cognitive skills. What seemed to predict better was actually how much cells and skills they had stored in their brain banks. And so there seem to be people who have low levels of cognitive reserve, fewer brain cells, fewer skills. And then there are other people who have higher levels of cognitive reserve. And so really the more cells and skills that you have stored in your brain bank really seem to predict how quickly you would kind of cross over that dementia threshold. This is the point where you start showing those clinical signs of memory loss that are, bad enough to get into your way. It's worse than normal aging. So Dr. Stern called it cognitive reserve, and that's definitely the name of the scientific theory. And it's one of those bona fide scientific theories. It's not like, oh, that's your theory, right? Like, no, like real, think back to 6th grade science class when you learn the scientific method, right? You have a hypothesis, you do a bunch of experiments, you take those results, you put them together to form a theory. And that's what this is. I call it your brain's 401k. Because it is quite literally like your brain's retirement account. So really, the more cells and skills that you have stored in your brain bank, the more you have to lose before showing those clinical signs of dementia. So I have made it my professional mission to spread the good news of cognitive reserve to every man, woman, and child across the globe. We'll see how far I get. We're starting with the book. So the book coming out next year is a workbook really designed around this whole theory to help you build up skills and activities, very similar to the list that Dr. Bentheim went over. We actually touch most of those areas of lifestyle, and to help you really actively invest in your brain 401k. And I also like to emphasize that this is important for the entire lifespan. No self-respecting financial planner would tell you to start saving for retirement at 50, right? So the same goes for your brain bank. The choices that we're making for our children, even in utero, there are some studies that show that mothers who are more physically active during pregnancy, that the babies come out with more brain activity. So across the entire lifespan, this is an important thing to think about because you can control it. Now, I am a scientist, so I do have to put in a disclaimer. You can control a decent amount of it. There are people who are born with brain trust funds who have, just genetically bigger brains. So it's not always fair. So they'll get a certain level of, privilege. So, and, you can't go back and you can't relive your 20s at this point, and drink a little less beer. But there is a decent amount that we can control. And so how do you control it, right? Well, so as Dr. Bentheim was saying, and even when I came into the field of neuroscience, which I think have been around a little, not quite as long, but the focus when we first started learning about cognitive reserve around the year 2000, we thought of the brain as very fixed, hardwired. And so the real focus at that point was to really work to minimize losses. Because, we thought, at the time, we really thought you had all the brains you're ever going to have when you're 20, and it was downhill from there. And so we would be like, don't bump your head, and like, let's, control risk factors. And that is still very much well and good and important. And so I do want to quickly go over some of the things that are kind of these robbers of your brain 401k. You might call them toxic assets. That joke's a little dated, but from the 2008 crisis. So anyway, so these are the things that are going to help like deplete your cognitive reserve. Head injury doesn't make the list, but that's one thing to pay attention to. Adults, wear a helmet on a bike. It's important to hold on to your brain 401k. It's a really valuable asset, as Dr. Bentheim was telling us. So So at each state, so this is the Lancet Commissions, as Dr. Benheim told us about, they weighed in and published a really large review of the current state of dementia prevention, intervention, and care. Now about 3 years ago. It came out in the summer of 2017, that really reviewed all of the science up to that point about what are the risk factors for dementia, what are the treatment interventions, what can we do to improve care. And part of that review was that they did a giant statistical analysis on all of the risk factors for dementia, and kind of came up with this model that really shows that your percent reduction, how much your personal risk might be reduced if one of these risk factors were eliminated from kind of like your lifestyle profile. And different things weighed differently at different parts of the lifespan. And so for early life, a little bit of your genetic, which is something you can't control, that plays an impact. Finishing the 8th grade is also very important. People who don't have a high school education often show signs of dementia much earlier than people who have gone farther in their education. In the midlife, the focus really is on hearing loss, correcting hearing loss. That's the biggest predictor. And I'm gonna give us a little bit fancier pointer. Okay, here's my laser. So hearing loss, if you have midlife hearing loss, get yourself a hearing aid, wear it. It's really important because less information is probably coming into your brain, and we know that use it or lose it is a thing. If your cells can't fire together, they don't wire together. And so we think a lot of atrophy may come from poor sensory input. Hypertension and midlife obesity are also robbers, risk factors. And then in later life, we have a whole other set of things that we may want to control. So if you can get grandma to stop smoking, it actually could matter quite a bit on whether or not or when she develops cognitive decline issues. So smoking, a big risk factor there. Depression, a really well-known risk factor for dementia, and it kind of loads in here at 4%. Physical inactivity, so being sedentary, social isolation, like Dr. Benheim taught us about, and controlling diabetes, all very important in helping kind of minimize those losses to the brain 401k. But in addition to minimizing losses, we now have data that you can actively invest in your brain 401k across your entire lifespan. And so how do we do that? Don't people have all the brains they're ever going to have when they're 20 and it's all downhill from there, right? I mean, isn't that the science? That's the science I was raised on. And, I might look a little younger than I am, but anyway, I was raised on that science. So I'm guessing you probably were too. But all of that has really been turned on its head. And so we now have a new zeitgeist, a new way of thinking about the adult brain. And it's what we call positive brain plasticity. We now know that adults can grow new brain cells. Dr. Benheim taught us about that. We're seeing adults in their 80s grow new brain cells. We're watching cells rewire. Regions of the brain can take on entirely new jobs. The way that these brain cells rewire is that the cells grow more synapses between and grow more connections. The synapses get stronger, and we're even watching regions of the brain get bigger and pathways between parts of the brain get bigger now that we have neuroimaging technology. Now, one thing I do want to point out is that you don't grow a lot of brain cells, so you do need to keep the ones you have. And brain cells don't grow all over the brain. They only grow in and around the hippocampus, the seahorse structure that Dr. Benheim was telling us about. That's where your new brain cells kind of grow in and around the hippocampus. So they seem to play a role in learning and memory, but keep in mind that they're not growing everywhere. Your brain isn't regenerating cells the way that your skin or your bone tissue might do. So you do need to keep the ones you have, but we grow new brain cells. Okay, so how do you minimize losses and maximize contributions to your brain 401k? Well, if we were to sit here and talk about all the ways that you can maximize your brain 401k investing, we would be here until sometime next Tuesday, I imagine. There's a lot of risk factors here. Dr. Benheim did a great job of summarizing, some of the kind of the big, top 7. And so if I had to boil it down to 3 things, I'm going to leave you with my Dr. All's 3 simple steps for brain 401k investing. And as you might have guessed after watching Dr. Benheim's presentation, that my #1 recommendation is to move your body. So we've known for a long time that physical activity plays a big role in like in those early studies of people who had higher cognitive reserve. They tended to be more physically active. We thought, well, what is that about? So at first we thought it had to do with better cardiovascular abilities, right? What's good for your heart is good for your brain. Your brain is reliant on a really fit heart and vasculature. And that is still very much true, but it may not be the only link. And so we're seeing a lot more, a lot of additional improvements or things that physical activity helps to improve your brain. For one, physical activity helps you grow more blood vessels in your brain. And that can come in really handy if you do have any kind of stroke activity that deprives your brain of blood flow. If you're physically active, you're more likely to have sort of a back door of blood supply, and then you may not lose as many cells. Now, remember those brain cells that we grow? Not a lot of them, but we do grow new brain cells. Physical activity helps you grow more brain cells, and it is the #1 lifestyle factor in terms of how much that we have good experimental evidence to show that this is the case. So people who are more physically active are popping out more brain cells than people who are not. In addition to more brain cells, your body produces these nerve growth factors, which are like Miracle-Gro for your brain cells. And so they help your baby brain cells grow up to be fully functioning neurons. They play a big role in that neuroplasticity of cells rewiring. And we're also seeing brain volume increase by way of physical activity. And so this study, I took some women in their 60s and randomly assigned them to 2 different exercise conditions, where one was sort of a stretching and toning group, and the other was like a really vigorous walking group, where they walked kind of the equivalent of about 2 miles in a 1-hour exercise program. And then they followed them. They measured the size of their hippocampus here. This is a really small hippocampus. But at the women in the stretching and toning group, their hippocampus shrunk by about 1.5% over the course of this study, which is actually not because of the stretching and toning, but it's really the rate of decline for women that age. But the women in the vigorous walking group, their hippocampus grew by 2%. And so the conclusion that these authors made, which I think is such a great line, is they said that, physical activity reverses 1 to 2 years of age-related volume loss. So I don't know about you, but if I'm up late watching some infomercial about like the latest, supplement for brain health, what is it, Prevagen now, which there's no science for that, by the way. So anyway, I'd be like, wow, if they said reverses 1 to 2 years of age-related volume loss, I'd be like, wow, that's really interesting. I'm also a trained skeptic. So I'd be like, let me see the science on that. But anyway, we have that for physical activity. And you don't have to spend $80 a month on some questionable supplement. Maybe you buy a new pair of sneakers. So how much physical activity do you need? So what we're learning is really, the more the better. We haven't quite seen a point of maximal returns. If you are already physically active, you don't show that hippocampus plumping the way we did, the way we saw it in those older women in that one study. There does seem to be a bit of a couch to 5K kind of effect. But in terms of popping out those brain cells, marathon runners do tend to be doing a little better than me. So So that said, but don't be discouraged because every little bit counts. And even walking as little as 6 to 9 miles a week, a study of women in their 70s tracked them for about 7 years to see who went on to develop Alzheimer's disease. And the women who walked at least 6 to 9 miles a week, significantly fewer of them went on to develop Alzheimer's disease over that 7-year period. And just getting up and moving around. You know, we're calling sitting the new smoking these days. So just, like that's why Apple Watch has the little buzzer every hour to kind of get you up and move. All right, so my number 2 is to learn new things. And we've gone over this quite a bit, so I'm not going to spend a ton of time here, except to share with you a little bit of the neuroscience of why this is important. So remember those baby brain cells that you popped out when you went for your walk? Well, those don't instantly become new neurons in the brain. They actually start off as stem cells, which means that they have to be stimulated by neighboring neurons in order to be trained. You got to give them a job so that they grow up to be new neurons. If they're not stimulated, then they get reabsorbed by the system, which is really just a nice way of saying that they die. So how do you stimulate these brain cells? Well, remember, they grow in and around the hippocampus. So learning anything new really does seem to be helpful. And so if you're asking yourself, is this, like the question that came in earlier, what about crossword puzzles? So here are the questions to ask yourself if you're wondering, is this a brain healthy activity, a stimulating activity? The Sharp Brain's Guide to Brain Fitness from about 10 years ago really summarized the science in this way. For something to kind of be considered brain challenging, any kind of intellectual activity, it needs to have novelty, variety, and challenge. And so, if you're doing Sudoku puzzles to fall asleep at night, then, it may not hit all of these criteria. So consider that for yourself. Is this novel? Do I have a variety? And am I being challenged? Am I kind of being pushed up against my ceiling? And as Dr. Benheim told us a lot about, socialization may actually be one of the most efficient forms of brain exercise. We're still waiting on some of the science on this to weigh in. This is a little bit of a hypothesis on my part, but think about it. In a simple conversation, you're listening, you're remembering what the other person says, that's using your temporal lobe, you're taking in visual cues, reading gestures and facial expression, that's activating your visual cortex, you're being nice, you're waiting your turn, you're thinking about what you want to say, using all of your executive skills and your motor skills. And, hopefully you're paying attention. And so even just a simple conversation is going to activate most of your brain. So, something to keep in mind. All right. And then my number 3 is meditate. So we've got move, learn, and meditate. And so why meditate? Well, Dr. Benheim's gone over this quite a bit already. We know that chronic high levels of stress are toxic to your brain cells. It keeps you from growing new brain cells. And then it also kills off the ones that you have. We see in some diseases where people have high levels of cortisol pulsing through their body, like Cushing's disease, that the hippocampus actually shrinks. So we don't need to get rid of all of our stress, nor, do you have to. And actually, you don't. It's A, it's impossible, and B, it's probably not that healthy. We need to have kind of a healthy balance between this fight or flight response where your body, right, when you're like really revved up, versus this rest and digest response where you're kind of, that should be kind of our resting baseline. The problem with humans and most other social primates is that we can activate our stress response purely with our thoughts. Like, what if I get COVID? How am I going to navigate the grocery store? Like, that guy's standing too close to me. So too many of us kind of live in this unhealthy state of like chronic fight or flight. And so meditation is a really great way to manage that, because there are lots of techniques that you can use to actively put your body into that rest and digest state. So simple breathing techniques, meditation, even fancy biofeedback techniques. So
Dr. All, real
yes,
quickly, would you consider praying and, praying, doing like religious activities, either it be weekly or daily as a meditation technique?
definitely. Yeah, we know that there are a lot of religious traditions that are very similar to meditation. So like centering prayer, um, I can't remember some of the other, they're not on here. They're on some of my other slides. But yeah, and actually spirituality, I mean, if we went all the way out to, and that's in my book, I have a chapter in my book on socialization and spirituality, because we know that people who attend weekly religious services live longer, and they do tend to have higher levels of cognitive reserve. We think that, probably has a lot to do with the relaxation involved, maybe the idea of a higher power, kind of letting go of stress, also a lot of the social support included. Yeah, thanks for that question.
Also, there's one more question.
Mhm.
Hopefully I'm saying it correctly. What about linoleic acid to help with cognitive function? What do you think about that?
What's it called again?
Linoleic. Oh my goodness. Whoever posted this, please chime in. Linoleic acid to help with cognitive function.
Yeah, I can't say I'm familiar with that, which I'm wondering if it's a supplement. And my take home for supplements is to, be really cautious. Remember that the FDA does not regulate supplements, dietary supplements in the United States. They're actually regulated by the USDA, so the same regulatory body that's in charge of the food. And so supplement companies don't actually have to prove any kind of effectiveness. They don't have to really substantiate any of their claims. And also there's very little regulation in what the concentration of a particular supplement is from pill to pill, bottle to bottle, batch to batch. And so when we have tested most supplements, they tend to not really have any kind of long-term beneficial effects. So I would be really wary of supplements. I tell people routinely that if you're going to dump money into your brain 401k, hire a personal trainer. You will get such a better ROI on your investment.
And that being said, do you know of any supplements that are actually detrimental?
I mean, I would be careful. I think this is really a conversation to have with your physician, because every body is different. And so we do need to be careful about supplements that can interact with your medications, medical conditions, those sorts of things. So, because even caffeine can have detrimental effects depending on your medical history. So, question for your doctor.
Excellent. Thank you.
So let's talk a little bit about neuropsychology. So I'm going to switch over. Switch over to a different slide deck here. So you have met today a geriatrician and a neurologist, and now you have met me, a neuropsychologist. So if you do suspect that you have dementia, you may end up seeing a lot of different doctors. And that evaluation process can be kind of lengthy, very frustrating. And so a lot of people ask me, what's the difference between a neurologist and a neuropsychologist? So Dr. Braun, we would consider her a primary care physician. She's a geriatrician specializing in older adults. Dr. Benheim is a neurologist, so he's a medical doctor who can prescribe medication and will assess you for lots of the neuromotor kinds of issues. He does kind of the whole neuro exam, to kind of look for your field of view and your hearing and your motor abilities. A neuropsychologist really focuses in on the brain behavior relationships. And what we do is quantify your cognitive abilities. And so neuropsychology involves a standardized and objective quantification of your cognitive performance, your memory, your attention, your executive skills. And we do that in a very standardized way. The testing is very similar to IQ testing, except that we're measuring the whole brain. So a lot of cognitive skills that aren't really considered part of IQ. We would consider IQ to be sort of a subset of neuropsych domains. And we compare your scores compared to people your same age and other types of demographics. It generally requires face-to-face assessment. So I would be cautious about computerized batteries that maybe are in like a neurologist's office. There can be some issues with those if the person who's monitoring that isn't really trained to pay attention to things like whether or not you got nervous or something like that. During the pandemic, a lot of the hospital-based clinics are back to face-to-face assessment. We've been trying to do a little bit by Zoom. There are some issues with validity that way. We're all just kind of doing the best we can. My clinic does offer neuropsychological assessment, but we are still doing it by Zoom. So we're only taking like a small set of cases. So we're not just doing decisional capacity evaluations at the moment because of those validity issues, but the hospital systems do have that. So, neuropsychologists want to know about the pretty holistic type of assessment and how it's different than like a mini mental status exam is that the mini mental takes about 10 minutes to administer, and pretty much any medical professional can give that examination. And it's great. It's so great that there are these screeners out there in the community, because imagine if you had to wait until you had an appointment with a bariatric surgeon to know how much you weighed, right? So if neuropsychologists are kind of hoarding all of the cognitive assessment, that doesn't help the community. So these screeners like the Mini Mental and the Montreal Cognitive Assessment, these are great to have, to be able to kind of get snapshots of people. What the neuropsych testing does is much more detailed. We want to see you maybe once a year. Medicare does pay for this. It takes, about 3 to 4 hours of testing. And how it's beneficial is that these screeners like the MoCA and the Mini Mental can miss a lot of like early stage changes. And so they're not quite as sensitive as what a neuropsych assessment is going to give you. Plus, neuropsychologists are psychologists first. And so we're trained to really pay attention to any kind of emotional interference. So anxiety can wreak a lot of havoc on memory performance, and so really take that into the interpretation of the results. So that's about my time. Do we have any more questions, Susie?
Judith, when financial and other systemic barriers such as lack of green space and safety matters in neighborhoods that may deter people, including elders, from engaging in physical activities as readily as others have it, what are you doing to close the gap?
So what am I, let's see, me personally, not a lot, except that I try to do as much advocacy as I can to really try to, drive home the importance of a lot of this. And I think we have a lot of great area agencies on aging, but I would, and I call Jan Schakowsky's office, about once a month. So I think we all need to pitch in on this. I'm happy to work with anybody to kind of support the science piece of it. But I think it's a community effort, and I appreciate you noticing these barriers because they're huge. I mean, there's some, and if we pulled even just the stress thread of, what different communities are dealing with, then we would see all sorts of variation in brain health. So yeah, thank you for your question. That's really great. Yeah, anybody else? All right, well, oh, Susie, you're on mute.
Sorry, I don't know what happened here.
That's it.
How can we sign up to get your book when it comes out? Is it geared to non-medical world?
Yeah, great. Okay, so here is, let me put that slide up again. So it is geared towards the non-medical world. The primary audience for the book is, it's a self-help workbook designed for you to use to work on your brain 401k investment. To sign up for it, it is email me. You can email me here and I'll just put you on my list. But if you want to sign in, there's also a form or like a place where you can enter your email yourself at this website. And a secondary audience is clinicians working with people with cognitive disorders or just anybody really. And so, so I wanted to throw that in there to say that because it is evidence-based. You know, I'm not recommending anything that it hasn't been research to support it. So there you go. Yeah. Any other questions?
No, that's it. Well, that was great. Thank you, Dr. All.
Thank you. Yeah, and we're right here in Chicago. So if you need to call us, there's the phone number. And thanks for having me.
Of course. No, thanks for participating. And of course, your recording of today, I know you put out a lot of information. Your recording will be made available on the chicagomemory.org, where a lot of the participants went to sign up on that website. Also, the website, under every speaker today, just to inform all of you, under every speaker that you have attended, please fill out the survey. There will be a link of a survey for that specific speaker. So we're welcoming your feedback, and of course, fill it out if you need CEUs. Well, now it's time for